listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I am Bob Schlehuber.
And I am Jamal Thomas. Let's get ready to go against the grain. Today we're talking about Bernie Sanders' dominant victory in Nevada caucus on Saturday. We're also going to dive into the stats from that Nevada caucus, in addition to talking about how the campaign's political, media, and moneyed established order is coming to grips with the will of the masses and pushing for a political revolution. I'll just say they're not handling it all that well. Later on in the show, we'll be discussing Julian Assange trial that's proceeding today. We have a reporter on the scene that will be giving us a sense of the trial atmosphere. Also, be sure to stay for our Mr. Press segment, the watchdog for mainstream media's prognostication and misinformation. Also, right now, we have breaking news. Apex pervert and sexual abuser Harvey Weinstein has been found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree sexual assault and rape in the 3rd degree. Let me repeat that. 2 counts of first-degree sexual assault and rape in the 3rd degree. The walker that he was using did not apparently help him get a less charge, or at the very least avoid conviction. But first, we have to start here. Today is a great day. Today is a great day. Now, I don't know about Bob. He's done double duty today, helping out with Fault Lines, our sister show, but I am hyped enough for both of us. Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, with his strong, masculine, powerful arms, takes Nevada. Let's hear Sanders' announcement. Let's hear the clip of Sanders.
And now I'm delighted to bring you some pretty good news. I think all of you know we won the popular vote in Iowa. We won the New Hampshire primary. And according to 3 networks in the AP, we have now won the Nevada caucus.
Bernie Sanders with 46.8%, Joe Biden with 20.4%, Pete 13.9%, with Warren at a distant 9.8%. This message is a resounding win, or I should say this win is a resounding message. The political revolution is real for the political class, the moneyed interests, and yeah, the media class. Deal with it. Many of the established order still don't get it. They don't understand how he inspires this much energy and momentum in the masses. They could be creatures crawling out of the earth like in Gears of War. They could be an alien invasion with Sanders supporters running and dodging, jumping, trying to get away from laser beams and death rays, still going to the precinct to make that vote. Or just a pedestrian bad weather. And yet they stand there, thousands, to make that vote or get into that particular rally. Possibly one of the funniest phenomena that I watched on Saturday was media, the cornucopia of millionaires on television, melt down at the prospect of the masses deciding to use the resources of the country to provide health care to human beings and allow maximization of potential via school without tens of thousands of dollars on the backs of children. Oh, perish the thought. It was like watching the polished, shiny TV of announcers on Hunger Games, complaining about the discontent and illogical response of the masses to improve their material existence. Chris Matthews comparing Sanders to winning the nomination to the Nazis taking France, postulating letting Trump win in 2020 would be the best interests of the Democrats as opposed to Sanders winning the nomination. More corpse than man, James Carville screaming that Putin wants Sanders to win to lose to Trump. And this, Jim, listening to Joy Ann Reid's guest begging for Obama to intervene into the race.
And so I would like to say to our current Democratic leaders in the country, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and anyone else, Mr. Clyburn's going to announce his endorsement on Wednesday. It's time for y'all to speak up. It's time for our leaders that we've elected over and over again, that are the 30,000-foot leaders of the Democratic Party, to speak up.
Anyone?
Because if you don't speak up now,
speak up, please?
then we're going to have Bernie Sanders as our nominee, and that is a disaster for the country. A major disaster for the country, and it will. And the infighting that's happening within this family right now, the Democratic family, is going to get worse and worse and worse. The reckoning is coming, and it's time for our former party leaders, who are the titular leaders of our party, to speak up and speak out and start endorsing. They got to do it now.
Only way to fix infighting, more infighting.
The reckoning is coming, all right. The reckoning is coming. Think about it. Think about what you just heard. This guy's screaming for help from a president that gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. Missing the point, comically missing the point, that the very reason that the masses are angry, that Sanders is enduring that much support, that much righteous indignation, is because of the onerous distribution of resources. The simple, clear fact is that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party has assiduously seen to the interests of the moneyed class, media being paid by that same class, against the interests of the 99%, and that 99% is beginning to notice how ludicrous the cooks, the cleaners, the haberdashers, the street sweepers, the people that bag your groceries, that take care of your kids, that write your computer programs, that bake your bread, that clean your streets, all of these people, all of the work, all of the labor from all of the people within the context of the United States, and the resources, the distribution of resources created by all of that work that all of those people are doing, get ferreted up to the 1%. How preposterous it is to believe that's fair. And how preposterous is this guy on mainstream media screaming for the guy that did it. Oligarchs, or let's say aspiring oligarchs, Stephen Klobuchar screaming red-faced that he'll stop giving money to the Democratic Party if they're using the word billionaire, invoking Pelosi and Schumer by name. The same thing on the Republican side, with Republican congressmen saying that he was told by his donors if he didn't pass Donald Trump's horrendous tax cut, that they should lose his phone number. No wonder people get dejected, discouraged, untethered to something larger than themselves, angry at the politicians and mainstream media that are so out of touch with the actual material concerns of most Americans. There is no point to this existence. There is no God, no being, no king that proclaims our arrangement. We choose. We as a collective decide. We choose either explicitly or implicitly. But for the first time in a generation, a campaign has harnessed the legitimate and righteous indignation of a nation, shaking and rattling complacency of the various people in our country. You've had politicians say you can't run a campaign like that. You've had politicians say you can't run without being bribed by oligarchs. You've had people trying to ape his policies. They say his supporters were sexist, and yet in one stadium after the next, he surges. Basic message: we're one, and your well-being is tied to my well-being. The speech that Sanders gave in the standing room only stadium in Texas after winning Nevada nails a key point that is often missed by outsiders, and it goes beyond the typical cynical politics that has carried the day over the last 50 years. After announcing his win, Sanders spends 30 minutes just yelling policy, one policy after the next. But the ending is the key ideological uniting point of his campaign. With the clips.
So what this campaign is about is understanding that if we do not allow Trump to divide us up by the color of our skin or where we were born or our religion or our sexual orientation, if we stand together, if we fight for an agenda that works for working families and the middle class, if we get involved in the political process, if we stand for justice, if we stand for compassion, if we understand that we are all in this together, that my family has to care about your family cares about my family. Brothers and sisters, if we stand together, we will not only defeat Trump, we will transform this country and create a government and an economy that works for all of us, not wealthy campaign contributors. Thank you all.
I don't know about you, but that makes me high listening to that. It is a mind-blowing effect. It is a mind-blowing feeling. It feels this kind of solidarity. This is not politics as usual. If you are just on the outside looking in, you may miss this, but there is something else here that the people who are there are connected to. There's a spiritual component that tries to reach beyond this specific technocratic, mechanistic triangulation playbook. As human beings, we need certain things to not just persist and not just survive, but to excel and maximize our potential. People often talk about human nature. Well, the truth is, human nature is water in a glass. There is never a situation where a person is in a vacuum. That person grew up in a family, in a society, in a culture, on a planet, all of which impacting who that person is and incentives pushing that person's behavior. My point is that the individual, without including the society, misses the larger component of the incentives that pushes human behavior. Fresh food, clean water, clean air, self-actualization and a sense of belonging. Without each, the person by extension will suffer, and by extension, so will the society. The political revolution, as Sanders has called it, is a unifying force pushing to change the hegemonic norm, changing our current cultural myth of rugged individualism and pull yourself up by your own bootstraps into something of cooperation and human development. Not in flowery rhetoric about values, but in tangible terms that works to the material interests of those that find themselves to be part of the larger movement. I've been to a Sanders rally. It literally feels like a religious experience. All of these people, black, white, gay, straight, men, women, different races, different cultures, all functioning together under new ideological mode of framing, with humanity as opposed to profit as its core. As I said, this is not politics as usual. Now, I predicted last year, before Sanders was in the lead, that he was going to win this nomination. Now, this wasn't wild-eyed hope. This wasn't me just coming up with a prediction and running with it. Trump is our president, meaning the fact has already been shown, or the proof of concept has already been shown. The country wants something fundamentally different. And the political revolution is here, and we just need to deal with it. And maybe there's some level of acceptance. We have Joy Ann Reid speaking to Chris Matthews saying this: the hungriest usually wins. Right now, it's the Sanders people, and I think the rest of us who look at politics have underestimated the sheer unadulterated rage, the anger of working class people, especially young people who are living in 3 roommates. They have a Lyft job and an Uber job, and they can't make it, and they're looking at Generation X. We're living well, and they're like, throw the table over. They're the hungriest, and the moderates, the mushy moderates, think they have the luxury of luxuriating, or whether they have someone who can speak 6 languages. Maybe today I want a woman from whom in the Midwest. Maybe I'll go with the vice president. No one is as hungry and as angry, enraged, and determined as the Sanders voters. Democrats need to sober up and figure out what the hell they're going to do about it. Yeah, the reckoning is coming. Bob, were you watching the news over the weekend? I was watching how media was melting down, coming to grips with this notion of, is this what he means by the political revolution? And have different media personalities dealing with this in different ways, where Julian Reid seemed to have some level of acceptance, Matthews, not so much. How on earth are they going to stop this quote-unquote political revolution? And what do you think they're going to end up doing in order to kind of hold back the night in the sense?
I'm going to take a different position than you.
Go for
One,
it.
for entertainment purposes, and 2, I guess I'm not a Democrat, and I'm very critical of the Democratic Party here in Washington, D.C. First and foremost, they're people that I have to work with because this whole city is Democrat elected officials.
Yeah.
I can promise you I've invited Democrats to more meetings around issues that matter to the people of Washington, D.C. than they invite me to. I get invitations all the time to soirees and happy hours and galas by the Democratic Party, but they're not actually out here doing the groundwork, and you need massive amounts of people to do political revolution.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Sanders has political revolution numbers yet.
Now,
And,
what are
and I say
political
that because, look,
revolution
you
numbers?
have 610,000 registered Democrats in Nevada. 33,000 people voted for Bernie Sanders. It's a tiny, tiny percentage of just one party. You have 1.6 million voters in Nevada, and you have roughly 100,000 taking part in this Democratic primary. That's 1 in 16 people that are registered. And so I guess I think it's too early to tell whether or not Bernie Sanders is able to organize the masses to create a revolution that gets him elected. He's saying, I need a political revolution
Yeah.
to be elected.
That's right.
I don't think that revolution's there today for him to get elected. What needs to then happen is people need to build and pull out more people. Once we see more and more people coming out and more of these numbers grow, then I'm willing to take on, is this a political revolution? Is the groundswell or the rumblings, are the diversity of people that need to be in the room there? Is it showing the potential? Yes. Is there enough people to organize that, mobilize that, door knock in the winter, door knock in the rain, and the heat of the summer across this country over the next 8-some months to deliver the White House for him? That's not shown to be there yet. Does he have the millions of volunteers? Does he have the money? All that stuff is in place. Yeah. Now it's whether or not that can be mobilized or not. And that's where he'll have to break through the media, break through the corporations, the 1%ers, the Barack Obamas, who's like clearly not going to speak out at this point.
Throwing his body into the race.
Because that was a big thing, right? Barack Obama in a private meeting said he'll speak up at some. Barack Obama's not going to speak up against the whole entire state of Nevada.
I don't think he
after
is.
Sanders just trounced him. Yeah. Everybody else, 47%. Like, sorry, Barack Obama's not going to. Barack Obama's chilling somewhere. He's not going to speak up on this one. It's a little too late for this. And yeah, nowhere to go. I mean, let's talk. We have a lot more after the break. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll dive deep into this. You're listening to Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
We call Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan the most disruptive radio show in America.
It's a great show, and we have a lot of fun.
We come to you live from Washington, D.C. every Monday through Friday morning.
What I like best is that we bring in experts from all over the world. From Barcelona, from Egypt, from Seoul, South Korea.
From Newark, New Jersey. We try to bring people great guests, great calls from our listeners, and, of course, stupid jokes. And we do it with two hosts that have very different viewpoints. Now, here's the thing, Garland. A lot of people would think you and I would just argue. I mean, I'm a Republican Trump supporter.
And, of course, I am a progressive Democrat Bernie Sanders supporter.
The surprising thing is how much we actually agree on.
And you won't be surprised because you're going to find out just how much you agree and just how much you enjoy this show.
Welcome back to Political Misfits, the show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with Bob Schlehuber, Iron Man, and we're talking about Bernie Sanders' strong-arm, unquestionable victory in Nevada caucuses, and a sudden awareness by the political media and moneyed elites that the political revolution is a real thing. While on this subject, the Democratic primary, we'd be doing a disservice if we didn't discuss the stats coming out in Nevada and the new polling that has dropped. If you want to contact us, give us a call at 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320 if you have anything to say on these topics or whatever is on your mind. But first, before we go into anything else, we have breaking news. Harvey Weinstein has been found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree sexual assault and rape in a 3rd degree, and Harvey Weinstein is being sent to jail immediately. So, here to discuss the events, we're joined by Joel Siegel, co-author of the original Medicare for All bill and national director of the Justice Action Mobilization Network. Joel, how are you doing today?
Well, when you hit age 60 and you open up your eyes and say every day is fantastic.
That's awesome. So I want to get into some numbers with you. We've had, interestingly enough, Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren have made this argument that Sanders doesn't quite have a broad coalition. Now, after Nevada, I was looking at some of the numbers in Nevada, and these numbers are rather stark. So let's just go through a few of the exit polling. Among Democrats who decided in the last few days, Sanders, 24%, Buttigieg, 18%, Warren, 17%, Biden, 15%. Among the interest polls, 18 to 45, Sanders, 60%. That is dominating. Buttigieg is next with 13%. 45 and older, Sanders, 20%. Biden, 20%, which again is mind-blowing considering for the longest time Sanders has had the hardest time getting people who are older. Here's another one. Whites, 28% Sanders. Buttigieg, 19%. Non-whites, 44% Sanders. 21% for Joe Biden. Hispanics, 51% Sanders. Joe Biden, 13%. These numbers are domineering. And we have among very young liberals, 52%. Sanders, Warren 17%. And the New York Times goes further than this. Self-described liberal voters, but also made inroads with moderates for the first time. Among self-described moderates or conservative voters, Sanders was the top vote getter, albeit narrowly. He captured 25% of the voters, while Biden captured 23%, according to entrance polls. So, Joel, how are they making this argument that this guy doesn't have a broad coalition when all the numbers as a testament to this saying he actually does? That's such a weird argument for them to make.
Well, if you're losing, then you'll make all kinds of weird arguments. You know, Buttigieg has tried to come off really as a, in my opinion, as a a white Obama, and his message has not resonated because his message isn't clear. Well, what are you for? Okay, I'm for Medicare for all who want it. Well, okay, well, what else? We don't know. But Bernie is even attracting voters who are white males without high school degrees.
Yes.
Voting for him. And this is really important because you look at the stats about the Trump when he won, a lot of the voters were white men without college degrees. And this includes men and women. He's not just building a coalition with young people. The stats clearly show that people who are, my age or let's say you're between 30 and 45 and 60, he's now getting their support because his message is resonating because America is hurting so bad when it comes to health care, child care, paying for school. I remember when my daughter was in college and I had to borrow money to get through my month, and I worked in Congress. It turns out Medicare for all, increasingly popular with Democrats, over 68% or 65% support it. Majority of Americans don't support it, but guess what? Majority of Democrats do support it. And I wrote that bill in 2003 and co-founded Progressive Democrats of America. I went to Congress with a deliberate strategy to create a progressive wing within the Democratic Party through the Progressive Caucus, writing progressive legislation like Jobs for All and Housing for All and, Medicare for All, to move the party into a progressive direction so people would actually get out and vote, because I felt like people just didn't vote in high numbers enough because the people running for office weren't speaking to their heart and mind. And Bernie does.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, one of the best and most interesting phenomena that I've seen in this is playing on what you just said. So when Hillary Clinton was running, she was, pandering, here's my hot sauce, guzzling hot sauce, breakdancing, singing with Mary J. Blige. But it created this weird phenomena where she alienated a section of the electorate in her plea for one other section of the electorate. Well, in Sanders' case, he's getting whites, blacks, and Hispanics. And it's not alienating one or the other. And I think a lot of that has to do with his basic argument of class. Meaning, I'm going to make an argument that is going to see to your material interests. You have, 50% of the population that didn't vote in the presidential election. And Sanders comes down and says, look, let's focus on using our material interests or the material resources that we create for our own interests. Now, for the longest time, the Democratic Party has argued that that is not a winning strategy. Well, it seems to be a winning strategy. And I would argue it's not even necessarily insane to foresee it's a winning strategy. Hey, we're going to help you in your material interests, meaning even if we take off healthcare and education, we're talking about a massive influx of cash that people will get with these bills off of their backs. So when you was pushing for the Medicare for All thing, basically you're arguing the exact same point that Sanders is arguing now in regards to how it benefits the population, correct?
Yes, because I grew up uninsured and underinsured, owed $150,000 in medical bills. Then I would go online, and in fact, I co-wrote the movie Sicko with Michael Moore.
Did you?
Yes, I did. And we weren't moving universal health care fast enough because a lot of the kids in Congress who were predominantly white and insured and came from wealthier families, they did not understand the experience that millions of people like myself had gone through which was being underinsured and uninsured and thrown out of hospitals. And I used to do civil disobedience to get a sleep apnea mask, and then I get calls all the time from across the country when we introduced the bill with these horror stories. But then I would hear the same stories about child care, unaffordable, or not being able to get into an apartment, or not being able to afford to go to college, or not be. I remember they used to take the federal government would take $780 out of my bank account because I couldn't pay back my student loans. I couldn't pay my law school loans back because I was very sick for 15 years, okay? So when Sanders is speaking, the majority of Americans are not of the 1%, or what John Kenneth Galbraith called the comfortable class. A really important concept. It's not just the 1%. It's not just billionaires. It's this new comfortable class that's been created post-Reagan that are so used to not paying any taxes that they fear a Bernie Sanders because they might have to pay a modest increase. They'll feel absolutely no pain. And actually, if you look at the tax rates, say between the, let's say, 40s, 50s, and 60s.
It's plummeted. I mean, it used to be at like 70% under JFK. And, if we're talking about FDR, what, 98% or something to that effect? Like, those numbers have plummeted going back from the 40s, the 50s, the 70s, up to the point we have now.
90%, that's right. So if you look at our corporate tax rates, it's like insane, right? And I worked with Bernie Sanders for 13 years. He used to park his car next to my car. He always had a bunch of books with him and magazines, and really, serious guy. His staff was the most brilliant staff on the Hill. Congress would write a bill on jobs for all, Medicare for all. We'd go to Bernie in the Senate. He would introduce it. But, this critique that he never passed bills, that is not true. He came up with this beautiful bill called the Housing Trust Fund to, deal with affordable housing. And also he put $10 billion into the community health clinics and Obamacare. And I know that because I was one of the, key staffers to get that darn bill passed and even to get it introduced. I was actually the founder of that movement in 1999. I'm just saying this because I want to give some context to these critics who know nothing about Bernie Sanders. And then Chris Matthews has the unmitigated nerve to go on national television and say that the election of Bernie Sanders is similar to the French when the Nazis invaded France.
It's utterly offensive.
Come on, man. He's a socialist. He's not a socialist. Bernie Sanders is a Franklin Delano Roosevelt New Deal Democrat. That's what he is. He wants to have more government involvement in the economy when he sees the private sector cannot deliver, your basic needs, health care, good schools, so forth and so on. He wants to take on the prison industrial complex. His coalition, by the way, is broadening every day. He's got way more. In Nevada, he got the majority of the Hispanic vote, and he was second in terms of the black vote to Biden. This is no all-white hippie movement. The Democratic establishment that I worked in for 40 years is scared to death of this guy because they think that he's too progressive and too left, and the right will use his socialist moniker against him, and they'll lose the White House. I disagree, and I'll close by saying if you look at the success of the Obama when he ran for president against the Clinton machine, he garnered the black vote, the Hispanic vote, and the young vote, and all the data showing if you want to win the White House, you got to get a dramatic increase in the black vote and the Hispanic vote. He's doing that already.
Yes, he is.
One group that he doesn't have support of yet is elected Congress people. If that tells you something right there, right? A lot of them have gone to Biden and Buttigieg and Bloomberg now. So it clearly shows that there is some people part of the coalition that aren't on board yet, as they slowly will maybe jump ship once it looks like if Sanders will be the nominee. We have a few callers here. We want to get in on this point. Charles, thank you for calling. You wanted to talk a little bit about the Democrats' relationship with the poor.
Hello?
Hey,
Hello.
Charles, how's it going? You're on the air.
Hey, what's up?
What's happening?
I wanted to add to the conversation by saying I think the Democratic Party has been long infiltrated by right-wingers.
Yes.
And And what I mean is, like, they say lefty things to get elected and everything, but they've been governing on the right side of the political spectrum, and it's like they've been undoing everything that FDR did. They've been, them with the assistance of Republicans, have been, because like when I say, like, Elizabeth Warren was a Republican until she was 47. Hillary Clinton was a Goldwater girl. Bill Clinton got his conservative roots in Arkansas, and he governed, you know, he did the military, he did the prison industrial complex and everything with the crime bill and all that. And,
cutting welfare.
And then you got Bloomberg, who was a Republican. So it's like the Democratic Party is just so open to right-wingers. It's not really a left-wing party at all.
Calvin, I agree with you, man. I mean, ultimately, we're talking about a party that takes as much cash as the other party. You have the same donors as the other party. And regardless of what they say, what matters is the policies that they put through. And I agree with you. They've been governing not like a left party that that helps with the rough edges of the capitalistic system, but more so like right-wingers. I agree.
Yeah, so it's like how do you explain that to people though? How do you get people to know the true dichotomy and that it's not really a right and left? It's more of a one party versus the people, or like because people are tricked into thinking that it's really opposite. They really believe that the parties are against each other and the Democrats are to the left. How do you correct that false notion? Like, there is no left.
That's a great call, Charles. Thank you so much. I'll let Joel Siegel answer that in a second. My quick answer to that is organize, organize, organize. You got to get out and educate people. Hopefully listen to our show, take a break after your morning organizing, listen to our show, and then get back out there and organize some more. But you win through organizing at this point. We have another call on the line. Killian, thank you for calling back. We really appreciate it. What's on your mind this morning, the afternoon?
I wanted to make 2 points about one about electability and one about Machiavellian ethics. So, related to electability, about how the mainstream media has been just has put a full-on onslaught of fake news or biased news. It's obviously a gray zone when you talk about that type of thing. About the electability of Bernie Sanders, even when they were talking about how Bernie lost or how Bernie wouldn't carry the Midwest, yet Hillary lost the Midwest to Bernie and lost it to Donald Trump. So, I mean, that's just like point one of that delusion that they've been trying to run against Bernie Sanders. And something that the Nevada caucus showed us was Bernie's Latino support shows us that Bernie could win a state that people forget is purple, Arizona, that he could win Arizona, and he could even rival for Texas. Obviously, that's a longer shot. But and then secondly, about Machiavellian ethics, related to that Chris Matthews clip where he talks about how it would be better for
for him to lose, essentially better for the Democratic Party. It's funny. Basically, it'll be better for the Democratic Party to allow Sanders to lose now so they can win in 4 years with somebody who essentially an establishment candidate. Because what Chris Matthews knows is exactly what I know, is that if he wins, he sets the agenda for the Democratic Party, and the person who comes after him is also going to set that agenda. And the moment that the guy... They've said for 40 years, it is impossible to run a campaign by grassroots. Candidates, for the most part, have to take that much cash and then do small incremental favors. And all at once, Sanders stands there and said, that's not true. Chris Matthews' point is, don't let him get in office because it's going to be hard to get him out.
Julian, thank you so much for the call. We continue to be joined by Joel Siegel. Joel, any thoughts on what the callers had to say there? How do you organize the masses in this moment right now? I also want to just note briefly here, go ahead and answer that question first before I turn to another question.
Well, I mean, I worked in the Democratic Party for 40 years, and then I worked in Congress for 13, and the majority of the time was spent with members of Congress raising money.
Yeah, 70%.
Yeah, that's right. So the Congress was run by young kids. I have nothing against young kids. But the majority of them had no clue about how to write legislation. They didn't have enough training. They didn't have enough policy background. And so this fear that members of Congress have about Bernie Sanders is if they align themselves with Bernie, they won't be able to raise money from the donor class. That's something that everyone really has to understand. That's their fear. The other fear, and Bob, I think you made an excellent point, by the way, earlier. is this fear that, okay, Bernie can capture, progressives, but he won't be able to capture enough votes to win the Electoral College and the Rust Belt states. But what we're seeing now, which is different than, let's say, Hillary Clinton campaign, is you're finding that these working families who are getting crushed with healthcare costs, college costs, child care costs, they're really like voting, in large numbers than we've ever seen before. That's a good sign. So I think what Bernie's going to have to do is really come up with some kind of a Marshall Plan where you create millions of jobs in the Rust Belt, which would include, of course, solar and wind energy, the manufacturing of electric batteries, wind turbines, solar panels, electric buses, trains, et cetera, et cetera. But he has to be, he can't whisper it. He's got to be loud about it. And he has to say, look, this is where Trump was very effective when he ran last time, what I call the new Trump dictatorship. You've got to appeal to the white-collar voters and even Hispanic voters. A lot of Hispanic voters are conservative, and black voters can be very conservative as well. But you have to be able to say, you know what, I know that you don't have a lot of jobs in these rural areas because your steel company closed down or the company that made your tractor trailers went to China. Here's my plan to put everybody to work, and he's going to have to show detail and explain it, but he's going to have to really kind of feel their pain and say, hey, I get it. And he's going to have to start finding surrogates. You don't have to be an elected official. You could find surrogates and do TV commercials with these white-collar workers who say why they're for Bernie Sanders. And I still think when he speaks, and I'll close, I think he should have a big American flag in the back of him with a picture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt or even Truman. Even though Truman busted unions.
You saw the new surrogate that Bernie Sanders picked up over the weekend, right, Jamar?
Which one?
Marianne Williamson.
Yes, I did.
Yeah,
yes,
I don't think Marianne Williamson's going to be out too often for Bernie Sanders.
I mean,
but she got people excited and riled up. I love Marianne Williamson. I think she comes with a lot of things, talking about how we can just be healthy and not even have health care issues and how sick we are as a nation, actually talking about ways to stay healthy and exercise, talking about reparations, racial inequality, all of those things. Her language is a few ticks off to the left of Bernie Sanders. It kind of turns people off in some ways.
Kind of.
We'll talk more about Marianne Williamson later. But Joel, I wanted to ask you with some 5 minutes left with you here. One thing that I thought was really telling from Nevada is if you looked at the 2018 ballot, two questions were on there. One was, do Nevadans want to break up their energy market to allow for private companies and the market force to basically play a role in deciding who picks which energy to use and break away from some of the state controls? And in Nevada, 67% of people said, no, we do not want to break up and allow the private market to go crazy with our energy market. So the environmental issue there in 2018 plays extremely well to the populace beyond just Democrats. And the other question that was on there, question 4, was the second time it was on the ballot, needed to pass twice, was to waive medical patient tax relief. So on different things like oxygen machines or hospital beds somebody might want to buy in their homes, the people of Nevada, again, overwhelmingly for the second time voted to waive that sales tax. And so right there, you saw 67% of all 1 million voters in Nevada, not just Democrats, this is Democrats, Republicans, independents, whatever else they call themselves, overwhelmingly voting to be pro-environment and for public regulation and for alleviating some of those medical costs. In many ways, this seems like, to me, the winning path for Bernie Sanders. Focus on the environment, focus on healthcare. This is already moving in this country. And so as much of it's about Bernie Sanders, it's also about Bernie Sanders capturing the movement of these policies right now.
You know your stats, Bob. And by the way, I think you're doing an excellent job as a commentator. I always knew you would be a special person, but I really like the
Thanks, Joel.
questions.
I pay him to say that, Jamar.
He's blushing. He's blushing,
you
Joel.
You can pay him, Jamar. He'll say the same things about you.
Bob rocks, baby. Well, I think in order to get he really is going to have to focus on the black vote and the Hispanic vote. Because the data shows if you get a dramatic increase and the black vote, right, and the Hispanic vote, you win. So the theory of the Democratic Party has always been you got to attract the Reagan Democrats, they call them, the crossover, right, the swing Democrats. And the data is showing that is a false narrative and a false premise. So I think if, right now Biden is first in terms of the black vote in South Carolina, but Sanders is cutting into that. But Sanders, I spent a lot of time with the Sanders campaign advocating for housing for all and jobs for all, but he's going to have to really go to South Carolina and really, I'm sure he's doing it with Nina Turner and folks like that, but he is going to have to really speak to their hearts and minds, and not just there, but across the country. I think if he gets a dramatic spike in the black and Hispanic vote, I think Bernie Sanders can win. I think he's going to have to do two other things. He has to fight back against this being labeled a socialist. He is not a socialist, okay?
Yeah.
When you own the means of production, or socialism would be the police department, the fire department, half of America's government service, right? He's not talking about socialism. He's talking about publicly financed, privately delivered,
Yeah.
But he's going to get crushed if he does not punch back. I mean, that's one thing Congressman Connors used to tell me. Joel, we're too nice to these guys in the right wing. Sometimes you got to punch them in the nose. And lastly, he's going to have to show the American people, here's where I'm going to be taxing the wealthy. I'm not going to soak them. You don't got to worry, middle class and upper middle class. There'll be modest proposals like a stock transaction tax, which is what we put in our bill for single payer. There's over I could show you a one-pager I did that I used to use for Mr. Conyers, where I could show you we can get $1 trillion easily from taxing corporations and closing loopholes. Bernie's going to have to do a little bit more on that end, and then that swing voters will go, you know what? He ain't talking about me. I'm going to get better health care and a possible job that pays a union scale wage and send my kids to college. And he's not a socialist. He's not a communist. It is amazing that Pete Buttigieg is calling Sanders someone who's involved in class warfare. He's acting like a Republican. That's their talking point.
Well, that's the way they're trying to attack him. But, I agree with you on the black vote issue. To me, the African-American vote mostly boils down to who keep the monsters at bay. And Joe Biden is kind of this after effect of Obama, including this notion of Joe Biden being, they've known him forever. So he comes across as being less risky when, the fact is, Joe Biden's electability argument has collapsed. And they're going into South Carolina, and some of the polling has shown Sanders is pulling like 3 points or 5 points away from Biden with the black vote. With the head of steam he's taken into Nevada, I think Sanders is going to be able to pull a segment of the black vote from Biden. He doesn't need to get all of them. Fact of the matter is, once he gets out of the primary, he will get the black vote. It's not like the black vote is somehow an anathema to Sanders on this front. We have a call. Let me see. We have Adam Kane. Adam, how's it going?
Not too bad. How about yourself, Jamal?
I'm doing all right. So what do you want to talk about today?
So I wanted to bring up that pretty much the Democratic establishment is now in damage control. What they're doing is they're pushing the narrative that there could be a contested convention. This only plays before Super Tuesday. After Super Tuesday, that is a meaningless talking point. They know Sanders is going to run away with it because there's a third of the delegates up on Super Tuesday, and he's going to have a majority and pretty much be so massive that no one has a chance to catch him.
Thank you, Adam. Joel, 2 minutes.
For months.
Do you think that they're going to have a brokered convention? I mean, they're threatening it. All of the candidates on the stage, when asked, for the most part, said, we're going to take our delegates to the convention. Personally, I think it would destroy the Democratic Party, but do you think they're willing to go through with that as opposed to having Sanders take it?
Yes. I think that what we have to be concerned about are the super delegates and who vote the second time. Yes, I think that we can expect to see at the Democratic National Convention the possibility of an internecine split and almost warfare where people the delegates vote, right? And say, well, we're not going to go along with because Bernie's going to win Texas and California.
Yes.
It's delegate rich.
And I'm betting South Carolina. That's my prognostication.
I think he can win South Carolina as well. And I think there's a very good possibility that during the convention they say we're going to vote for who we think would be the second best person other than Bernie. Maybe I think it would be Elizabeth Warren. I don't think it'd be Biden. I think it'd be Elizabeth Warren. She'd be like the second choice because she's viewed as a capitalist, not a socialist, so forth and so on, but has the progressive policies as Sanders. Yes, I'm very, very concerned about this. That's why I'm saying some of the things that Bernie needs to do to cool people out and ameliorate some of those fears of him being a socialist. He's going to choke the rich, so forth and so on, and getting more surrogates to go on TV, radio, and the press who just don't scare people. And I'm going to have to tell you, as a Jewish person, there's a bit of anti-Semitism at play here. You got a guy with a strong Brooklyn accent. He's, very, very forthright in his views. And, a lot of people, that scares people. But don't ever underestimate anti-Semitism, okay? It may not be that they hate Jewish people, but they have a problem with someone with a strong, Brooklyn accent who waves his hands and arms as we Jewish people in here do. His policies, they're just not radical, man.
No, they're not.
They're very Democrat. The problem is he's really running as a real Democrat and not a moderate, centrist Democrat. And that's what's scaring the Democratic establishment, that post-Reagan and post-W. Bush became centrist corporate Democrats. He's running as a real Democrat, and they're afraid of him.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the Democrats always talk about a big tent. It's like everybody's welcome under the tent, but you only get so much power if you're under here for certain people. So everybody's included, but no one's actually included. I did want to kind of just reference there the brokered convention idea. The thing that becomes very hard for me to imagine at this point, Jamarl, is if Bernie Sanders can win California and Texas by big numbers, one, he might actually end up with a majority of delegates, and then the brokered convention idea is gone, because if you're past the 50% mark going in, those super delegates don't even come into play.
Right.
It's when it's when you don't have a majority, the super delegates kick in for a second round of voting. The 50% mark is higher. But how does an Elizabeth Warren, who's finished dismally in these first 3 states, how does she go to South Carolina or go into Super Tuesday, don't show well, and then all of a sudden be the one that is picked to be the leader? That doesn't make any sense to me. And maybe she drops out early and simply says, look, we were doing well, we backed off, we didn't have the resources, but I'm still this candidate. I don't really know where she goes, and it's not going to be Bloomberg either at this point, I don't think. So I'm not really sure who the brokered convention idea would go to. Obviously, the Democrats are quite creative and would come up with somebody like Michelle Obama or
Michelle Obama steps in. It was like, what? She hasn't won any states.
Well, let's take a quick break before we go to London to get the latest from Julian Assange's extradition treaty. You're listening to Political Misfits. Joel Siegel, big thank you. We'll continue to follow the Democratic primaries that move forward, but we're going to take a quick break here on Radio Sputnik. You're listening to Political Misfits. We're back after this.
Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed soundbites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear, 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Iron Man Bob Schlehuber. We've been talking about the results of the Nevada primary, and we're going to get back to that. But first, we're going to turn into an important process underway, the extradition Jesus Christ, I'm having double difficulty saying it. The extradition trial of Julian Assange that has began today in London. Give us a call at 202-521-1320 if you have anything to say on the topic. We're going to turn to Walter Smolarek, Sputnik News analyst who's in London to cover this crucial trial. The lawyers for the United States began arguing their case for Assange should be extradited and stand trial in America. They opened by alleging the secret sources who had supplied information to the U.S. government, quote-unquote, disappeared after they were put at risk of death or torture by WikiLeaks' release of classified documents, as The Guardian put it. Lawyers for the United States refer to a range of sources in states including Iraq, Afghanistan, and China. Walter, how are you doing today?
Very good, very good.
Excellent. Can you refresh us on the scope of the trial? What's going to be covered and what's excluded? Also, can you give us a little bit of feeling about how it is around here? I know there's been a lot of noise in the area that's been affecting the trial.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a demonstration outside today. There's sort of a protest camp set up outside Woolwich Court, which is sort of attached to Belmarsh Prison, where Julian Assange has been, held in really atrocious conditions for quite some time now. Yeah, so there's the demonstration going on, very, very spirited. It kind of, has the feel of like an Occupy movement encampment. And so, the noise from the demonstration, according to reports, was audible inside of the courtroom. It's sort of a demonstration of the kind of grassroots support, grassroots mobilization that's been going on to defend WikiLeaks. In terms of the scope of the trial, what's actually being decided is not whether or not Julian Assange is guilty of what the U.S. government has charged him with, and that would be 17 counts, astonishingly 17 counts under the Espionage Act, as well as one charge of computer hacking, basically. So that would be enough to land him in prison for 175 years under the U.S. Criminal Code. But what this court in the UK is deciding is whether or not to extradite Julian Assange to the United States. And so the U.S. government's lawyers, as you laid out in the intro, are arguing that this is just a straightforward case about criminality and the reporting of WikiLeaks, their publication of these documents, put these sources at risk. But what Julian Assange's lawyers are arguing is that this is actually sort of the essence of journalism, publishing documents that are, inconvenient to the rich and powerful, that expose their misdeeds, that expose their, in the case of, the collateral murder video, for instance, their war crimes. And that, what Julian Assange did by basically, providing like tips to his source about how to remain anonymous is just a standard journalistic practice. And what's happening is the criminalization of journalism by the U.S. government with this extradition request.
Yeah, the idea of an extradition request is fascinating to me, Walter, to juxtapose two stories around extradition over the last year. One is we have this situation in Hong Kong, which sparked massive protests around them not wanting an extradition treaty with China, which was sparked by a young man who kills his pregnant girlfriend in Taiwan, flees to Hong Kong, and everybody's against extradition treaties because, what could happen next? China would all of a sudden want to grab anybody and everyone around political purposes. Now you have this other extradition treaty where people are like, yeah, extradite Julian Assange to the United States, but no one's concerned about what the United States can do to anybody anywhere in the world who's not a U.S. citizen for a non-violent crime. And sure, obviously, prosecutors are arguing that Julian Assange put all these people's lives in danger and so forth. But Julian Assange, a publisher, a journalist, somebody has a platform for whistleblowers. He's like, extradition treaty to America, that's great. Something in China for a murderer, that's a bad extradition kind of deal.
Just to be clear, Assange didn't technically commit a crime. I mean, the U.S. is accusing him of a crime based on our laws, but I'm unclear on the crime that he actually committed. He was a publisher of information. And by the way, if he gets caught, everybody else is fair game. We need to be very clear about that. I mean, ultimately, we're talking about somebody who was publishing information that embarrassed or, certain classes of the established order didn't particularly like. Walter, what are they making that argument basically that effectively any prosecution of Julian Assange for this very specific notion of espionage will have dramatic effects on media going forward, pretty much in any country that has the potential to disclose information that the United States doesn't like?
Oh, well, certainly that's true. And that's something that WikiLeaks supporters have been saying throughout this entire time and is legally important as well. The chilling effect that this would have on journalism. I mean, the profession of journalism. I mean, if you think that, if you're a journalist, if you're a publisher, and you think that, what you're doing, your professional activities could land you in prison for, in the case of Julian Assange, 175 years. I mean, you're going to be much, much more discerning, discriminating about what you end up publishing. And that's going to be to the detriment of the public interest, because it means that people will know less about what the government that speaks in its name is doing all around the world. So, yeah, I mean, the fact that Julian Assange carried out these publishing activities, journalistic activities, not even in the United States, right? I mean, he was in Europe, he was in the UK, he's an Australian citizen, and yet the United States basically wants to extrajudicially apply its laws, its own Espionage Act, which is this draconian statute from 1917. And, they want basically every government around the world to enforce that law for them and to basically drag before U.S. courts anybody who dares to defy them.
Walter, I'm curious the response there by British media, and as you said, it's going to have a chilling effect. And if they come at, for one journalist, they could come at anyone. BBC writing, and just a language they used throughout. They had talked about how Julian Assange was hiding in the Ecuadorian embassy. It's like, by hiding you mean he was under 24/7 surveillance by multiple different countries watching him at every moment, waiting for him to do anything and everything. And so obviously the BBC is not going out on a limb for Julian Assange. But again, like you said, this has a chilling effect on the whole media landscape. I'm curious what media you've seen there. And obviously it'll be interesting to talk to you as the week goes on, if it's just kind of everybody's out today because it's the first day. But how many other media outlets and media people really get the degree, the seriousness that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was, considerable coverage of it, pretty wide coverage of it across outlets, but the quality of that coverage and, what they're deciding to highlight is something that I think leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, the fact that all of these mainstream outlets, I mean, every major outlet all around the world uses the information that WikiLeaks uncovers, right? I mean, this is, groundbreaking information that they're able to publish and publish without a filter, right? I mean, they just put the documents on the internet for anybody to see. The only type of journalist that isn't afraid of the chilling effect that this has are people who basically only publish what the wealthy and powerful want to read anyway in the first place. If you have any desire to publish information that could be inconvenient, uncomfortable, damaging to the powers that be, then you have a stake in the outcome of this trial.
Essentially, the Chuck Todds of the world, who are basically stenographers, he's going to be safe. Anybody else that wants to push the needle, not so much. What is the scene like? I know you said there were protesters, there were people complaining and arguing. We have about 2 minutes. What's going on around the trial? I mean, as far as I understand, there's a large protest going outside at the same time.
Yes, there is. So the largest protest so far was last Saturday. There was a pretty sizable march, and a lot of the more high-profile supporters of WikiLeaks were there as well. Roger Waters. Julian Assange's father was there today. He was addressing journalists and supporters and activists. So the protest camp is going to be in place for the duration of the trial. There were maybe about 15 tents that I saw set up. And I mean, it's pretty impressive. Like the field, immediately outside the courthouse that they're in is like completely soaked. It's been very rainy all day here today. And so it's just mud, but people are sticking it out in pretty tough conditions. It's cold, but people have a lot of energy. There's a lot of solidarity that's really like palpable when you just walk around the crowd.
Well,
and,
we have
also
1 minute.
People came from Well, it's interesting. People came from all over to attend this demonstration. In fact, I would say maybe even the majority of people there are actually French. Half the people, maybe 2/3 of the people.
Yeah,
are
remarkable number of yellow vest protesters there. If you want to join the actions in Washington, D.C., if you're listening, actionforassange.com. A march was scheduled today from the White House to Trump Tower to the Department of Justice. That march is going on right now. We're going to be back with another hour here of Political Misfits. You're listening to us live in Washington, D.C. on Radio Sputnik. We're going to be back right after this.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I am Bob Schlehuber here with Jamal Thomas. Get ready to go against the grain. Lots to cover over the next hour, including the mainstream media's collective freak out over Bernie Sanders' victory in Nevada. It was something to see. They're really struggling. If you got any thoughts on this madness, tweet us or give us a call at 202-521-1320. We are now joined by Brianna Griffith, the producer and host of the People's Republic Austin radio program, to talk about the media's response to the Nevada Democratic primary results. That meltdown was almost as gratifying as the Sanders victory, and not necessarily gratifying for me in the sense that Sanders won, but because this is what we have said at Radio Sputnik. We've been focused on accurate reporting. We've been focused on what polls actually matter, which polls don't matter. We are focused on telling people here on our station what people across the country are saying. And it was clear over the last 9 months that Joe Biden was not going to be a long-standing frontrunner. And it was clear 9 months, a year ago, 2 years ago, that Bernie Sanders had built out the political infrastructure through his organization, Our Revolution, and through what he was able to do in 2016, that he was going to be a frontrunner and have a machine that was turning out for him. This is what we've been saying on Radio Sputnik, and that's gratifying to see it play out, is because this is what we were reporting. Mainstream media, regular media, other media, so many people have been announcing Joe Biden as the front runner somehow. Michael Bloomberg was going to sweep in. Pete Buttigieg wins Iowa, and so he'll surge to the front in states that he wasn't going to. That's the reporting that has been out there, and that's not what we said here. We said exactly what happened was going to happen, and it did, and that's what's gratifying for us. As I said, we're joined by Brianna Griffith. Brianna, so you'd expect finally some of these news outlets and hosts acknowledge that they were wrong. And obviously, of course, they weren't going to acknowledge they were wrong. And you know what they did instead?
Not so much.
Instead, let's compare Sanders' campaign to Nazis. And so first, last week, we had Chuck Todd last week repeating the insane comparison of Sanders supporters to brown shirts. Yeah, the brown shirt Nazi stormtroopers who guarded party meetings. And now we have hardballer Chris Matthews also speaking on MSNBC, comparing Sanders' victory in Nevada to the fall of France in 1940 to the Nazis. Let's listen to Chris Matthews' bizarre comparison here.
I'm reading last night about the fall of France in the summer of 1940, and the general, Renault, calls up Churchill and says, "It's over." And Churchill said, "How can it be? You got the greatest army in Europe. How can it be over?" He said, "It's over." So I had that suppressed feeling. I can't be as wild as Carville, but he is damn smart, and I think he's damn right on this one.
Wow.
Okay, well, he's not. He's not.
That's so offensive.
So, Brianna, which hashtag are you helping push right now? Fire Chuck Todd or hashtag fire Chris Matthews?
I would say maybe a little of both, but it's not like you said, like this is very obviously very, very offensive. I mean, it's very obvious that like comparing Bernie Sanders, a Jewish man, to a Hitler is just absolutely. I mean, it's beyond the pale. But we had kind of seen that that kind of line of attack greenlit, I think, by a Washington Examiner article a while back, basically implying that the Sanders campaign was somehow anti-Semitic through some really twisted logic there. But I mean, yeah, like you said, it was clear from the very beginning that Sanders was going to be the front runner. It was clear that he was the one, not only who had the kind of name recognition, but he was the one who had the infrastructure on the ground. We've seen that in here in Texas a whole lot. Nobody else is pulling out nearly the numbers of kind of, especially like working class Black and brown people who are campaigning in their spare time, who are volunteering, not just for Sanders himself, but for kind of a down ballot, like local and state level candidates
and just
as well.
To briefly note, on Saturday night, as the Nevada numbers were coming in, Bernie Sanders was not in Nevada. He was in Texas.
That's right.
Already campaigning there.
Massive rally.
And so maybe, speak a little bit to that, because I think it's interesting. There's a lot of down ballot candidates in Texas. I forget the congressperson running in Laredo, but basically there are those down ballot Democrats that are willing to say, yes, we do need the establishment out, because so many people like Joe Biden are basically saying, look, you're going to hurt everybody down ballot. I've been the one out there campaigning for these different people. Well, the Joe Crowleys of the world, as proven by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, need to go, and they can lose if they get candidates to the left that are speaking to issues like immigration loudly and accurately. A lot of these establishment Democrats are going to fall along with the other Democrats higher up in the ballot. And I think that speaks to what Bernie Sanders is creating. It's not just Bernie Sanders out here alone. There's a lot of candidates down ballot that are amplifying and echoing what he's saying.
Yeah, that's certainly the case within Texas. I see that a lot in Austin with, for instance, the different Democratic socialist groups. DSA out here has done a lot of kind of work with different local candidates, like Heidi Sloan, for instance. And basically, the idea is to be campaigning not just for Sanders himself, not just for these local candidates, but to try and really like talk to people about the entire platform that's going on. To say like, this is what's wrong with the system. This is what this is kind of what quote unquote our fixes are. I'm not with DSA, but sort of this is the way they kind of approach it. And so yeah, they're out there like talking to people about basically the entire progressive insurgency. Yeah. And I think that's why Sanders has come out and basically had such a successful first few wins in these states, is because there really is that campaign infrastructure there, and it's because they're inspiring a lot of people who otherwise feel absolutely cut out of this entire political process. The rest of the Texas Democratic Party is really not interested in this movement at all. The sort of Texas Democratic establishment is very much sort of still interested in like running these Republican-like candidates. And I think they're as frustrated as anybody to see, or they're as frustrated as anyone within the establishment to see that there's this progressive insurgency that's actually, in a way, trying to win Texas for an actual platform, rather than just what the Texas Democratic thing is usually to do, which is just like to get the 45% and say, oh, look, we raised ourselves 3% since last election, or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, that's Jessica Cisneros, who's running there in Texas's 28th district versus Congressman Henry Cuellar. And Henry Cuellar is against the Green New Deal, and she's running basically saying this guy's against the Green New Deal, focusing on environmental issues, focusing on immigration issues, focusing on healthcare. And that's what coming out of Nevada, Jamal, really spoke out to me is, look, healthcare and the environment and immigration are three huge winning issues amongst Latino voters and voters out west.
Yes, especially when you get into this notion of jobs, you get into this notion of healthcare. Like when you take off healthcare and education just by itself, if you think of everything else, all of the expenses of a person just to go from point A to point B, and you say your hospital debt is gone, you don't have to pay for this kind of intangible bill, that's gone. And also your education debt, meaning you can be as poor can be, and yet still maximize your potential in the context of education. That is massive sea change in regards to our political space. Making that argument wins black, white, Hispanic across the board. Is that what you're seeing in Texas for the most part, that this argument, and not from the Democratic establishment part, I think they are getting it wrong. I think the Democratic establishment and the media establishment are telling you their hopes as opposed to giving you absolute, or at the very least objective, reality. It was clear that there was going to be a coalition of people backing Sanders. And that was clear in Iowa, that was clear in New Hampshire, and it's definitely clear in Nevada. And at some point, these guys are still screaming for help, just trying to stop this, missing the point that the public is on board for this. And either the Democratic establishment is going to go with it or not. Also, just to make a basic point, John Kerry lost, Al Gore lost, Hillary Clinton lost. All of these people who, for the most part, were centrist Democrats, lost. 1,100 seats they lost in 2016. It's a sea change. It's like you can't lose that much. It's a loss of legitimacy without having some other factor to kind of grow and try to take over the party. I would make the argument that these guys, for the most part, are just having a situation where the party is just being cannibalized because the party was incapable of actually holding the monsters at bay. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, like, you to a large degree have to have a lot of confidence within the public, within the people, even in these so-called conservative states, because I think the reality is that the vast majority of people within this state, they're not like anti-Medicare for all. They're not more conservative, in a lot of ways, especially, again, like the working Black and brown people. They want these things as much as anybody. The South, I don't think, is nearly as conservative as people think. It's simply that voters are so disenfranchised here, and that the Democratic Party just hasn't really cared about that. The much of the Democratic Party establishment here actually does rely on that low voter turnout. So there is this there's this progressive movement surging forth that is talking to people's issues, and what they have on their side more than anything is volunteer power. They have people who are willing to sort of show up, and it is sort of a, it is a sea change. The Democratic Party at large, the Democratic Party nationwide, I don't think is going to be able to survive this without some sort of, major kind of sea change, major rebranding. For sure, they're not really able to kind of play to the quote unquote center, because for all intents and purposes, there really is no center. These people running as centrist, Mike Bloomberg, for instance, he's a lifelong Republican. Yeah. And the sort of the attack was trotted out that Sanders, quote unquote, wasn't a real Democrat, as though anyone at all cares about that.
Isn't that so sad?
They haven't really said that about Bloomberg. Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't that so sad? Oh, he's not a real Democrat. He's not a real Democrat. All right. Well, let's pull Michael Bloomberg, who's a Republican. Look, Sanders is more of a Democrat than anybody else that's ran in 40 years. Let's be clear, like, especially if we're talking about this image of the FDR Democrat. Yes, he calls himself a democratic socialist. But in real terms, Sanders is not a socialist. Like, you have real socialists screaming, that guy's not a socialist. But he uses that to define himself as something distinct and different than the other candidates. Do you think that would hurt him in Texas? I mean, some people make the argument that the democratic socialist thing is a headwind. And to be honest, I do think any random person calling himself a socialist may be a headwind. But this is kind of the black friend thing. It's like, yeah, I may think about blacks in a particular way, but Bob is my black friend. And I know Bob, his family is nice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's almost like we know him, and so he's grandfathered in. Or would this really be somewhat of a headwind? I mean, you live in Texas. What's the sense on the ground in Texas?
So you're kind of asking specifically about whether, like, Sanders, self-identifying as a socialist is going to hurt him.
Yes.
I don't think so. I mean, again, it could simply be that the people I'm talking to are generally kind of more progressive leaning, but I don't think that the label really carries the same sort of weight. I don't think that the sort of like fear mongering, that Cold War era fear mongering, is really there anymore. And it's especially not really there amongst the kind of people Sanders is reaching out to. I mean, sure, there's a percentage of people who are very rabidly anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti the left in general, et cetera, et cetera. There's like a section of people, kind of along the liberal spectrum in the same way, just refuse to even kind of hear the words. But I mean, for I think the vast majority of working people, like the reforms he's talking about, make a lot of sense at a very intuitive level, even if you're not kind of like into the socialist theory and whatnot. I mean, Sanders is really, I think most people would recognize these Sanders-style reforms as sort of like just a New Deal or Great Society kind of like social reforms that really are not that radical. I don't think there are that many people who are really thinking that they're that radical here.
Yeah, we have a caller on the line that wants to talk a little bit more about Bernie Sanders. Diana, thank you so much for giving us a call. What is on your mind?
Absolutely. Hi. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say, Jamal, I love you. I watch your show all the time.
Aw, thank you. Kisses on the ego are always welcome.
Thank you. Well, I am from PA, and I'm a Hispanic mom of 6. I work. My husband works. And 7 years ago, both my husband and I had great jobs. We were making it. We were going up there. We had 5 children at a time, and we found out our daughter had cancer after we just bought our house. Mm-hmm. So the same day we found out our daughter had cancer, the same day we found out we were pregnant with number 6. So, yes, it was I'm sorry, I'm nervous.
No, you're fine. Don't be nervous. Basically, healthcare, education, these things are crucial for a situation like this without the person going bankrupt.
Yes, and I want everybody to understand something. You know, fast forward to 7 years later, my daughter had a bone marrow transplant throughout this whole entire process. She had everything. She is, thank God, 6 years cancer-free. But because she's 6 years cancer-free doesn't mean that the problems went away. You know, she had radiation, so she's got no immune system. So therefore, she can't get sick too often, you know, and she has to have an IV every week just to keep her alive, you know. Now, here's the thing. We are on SSI because we have to be. A lot of people don't understand that sometimes you're on SSI because it's not by choice. It's because you have to. Because the medical insurance that SSI provides covers you more than what the government, just the regular Medicaid provides.
Yes.
In the state. And that's not even enough because every year we have to fight them because they want to get her off of it every year. Now, my husband and I, with 6 children, we cannot make past $65,000. We don't qualify for food stamps in this state because the rules have changed, and we cannot, some days we can't eat. My husband and I won't eat. We feed our children, but we go hungry because it's more important to keep our child alive than to put food on our table. So when my husband gets home at 6:30 at night, sometimes we go rally for Bernie. We go knock on doors. I work all day and so does he, and we still cannot make it because we cannot, because we have to choose SSI over putting food on the table.
Deanna, so I want to keep you on the line for the moment. So I personally, I was developed kidney failure at 17, and you end up in this weird donut hole where, all right, if I work, then I'm going to lose access to Medicare, Medicaid, which is, the medical bills are going to be overwhelming, and so you're stuck in this position at that particular age where you just can't work, and you must collect either SSI or Medicare, Medicaid in order to make your way because the medical bills in and of themselves are going to be too much. Well, my mom, when I was developed in, my mom, for the most part, was barely making ends meet, and now she has a kid that has some kind of major illness. It's like, how do you deal with that? You have a slew of medical bills, even if you have healthcare insurance. The healthcare insurance, you're still inundated with bills as you go from one specialist to the next, to one emergency room visit, to one hospital visit, to the next. So I absolutely understand to some degree where you're coming from. Of course, we didn't have multiple kids. She only had one. But even with that, it wasn't like she was making ends meet great to begin with. And now you have this new burden on. We are not alone in this.
No, we're not.
And that's the issue, right? I mean, the fact that there are a lot of us that are out here that are struggling with something that we didn't necessarily do ourselves. Meaning, it wasn't my fault that I developed kidney failure. It wasn't your fault that your kid developed an illness. And yet we're stuck with this almost in this kind of regressive way of having to deal with it individually as our family and having that family to essentially struggle to make ends meet. So
And that the insurance doesn't even cover everything because, my daughter, she just had cataract surgery on both eyes, okay? Her 10-year-old, because of radiation, has a lot of problems in the aftermath.
Yeah.
And we have to sign a waiver that we will pay for it. Haven't looked at the bill because I can't afford it. So, we had to sign that waiver because the insurance company, even though she has government insurance, still won't pay for that because it's not within network. Where the doctor wanted her to go to. It's not within network. So therefore, it had to come out of pocket. My husband and I, we are just sick and tired of being sick and tired. We're sick and tired of the media portraying everything the way that they are. And we had even gone as far as to say, hey, this time around, if they steal this election from Bernie, we will vote for Trump. We would. You know why? Because at the end of the day, you're not stealing the election from Bernie. You're stealing it from us.
That's right. That's right. Diana, thank you for calling in.
Diana, thank you for the call. Yeah, and that note for me, just one, how strong and powerful Diana and your family have been is uplifting. It's encouraging. It's very motivating to continue the fight for all that we do to make it better for people like yourself that are so screwed over by so many greedy people in this country for no reason but just to pad their pockets and profiteer off of it. And the media complicity in this, the thing I was looking at a lot as I dived into the numbers over the weekend was the last big official poll that came out of Nevada and was from Emerson. And everyone in their poll is within the margin of error except 2 candidates for their poll. The first person that was not within their margin of error was Tom Steyer, who they had at 10%. And we were laughing at that one poll that had Tom Steyer winning Nevada. I mean, it's like, how do you put this out? How do you even put this out if you're the pollster that Tom Steyer, who finishes with 4% of the vote, was somehow going to win Nevada? Like, pay attention, people.
Yeah.
And then the other second person outside of the margin of error is Bernie Sanders. And this Emerson poll had him at about 30%. He finishes at a roughly about 40% of 40% of the popular vote. And then the delegate equivalent for that of how the math works out is a roughly 47, 48%. But well without it. It's because these media outlets and these big pollsters who are partnering with these media outlets aren't polling your everyday peoples. As much as they think they are, there is a language issue and a barrier to their polls of if it's interviewing people that don't speak English as a first language.
Yeah.
Are you hitting young people? Are you hitting people that aren't answering their phones or doing targeted media selections online for these polls? So there's a huge percentage of people that are not polled or discovered within these media outlets, and then they underreport them and then don't talk about these people, basically erasing them when they just lean on polls. And what actually happens, Brianna, the polls are way off, showing basically that these media outlets, these last weeks of using these polls, aren't talking about the Dianes of the world and what's going on in their lives, or the casino workers or the culinary workers who rejected their bosses and turned out strong for Bernie Sanders.
That's right.
Where are those media stories the last few weeks?
Yeah, well, I mean, even going back, I think there were a lot of media polls who were relying, for instance, on landlines or whatnot, like as early on, and that's why Biden had such a heavy lead. Yeah, like you said, it was completely sort of absent from the narrative of just how clear it was that Sanders was the front runner. I think a lot of candidates even sort of entered. I mean, there were people, a lot of people I were hearing basically saying that like these other candidates were entering to try and essentially destroy that momentum right at the beginning. And yet thinking of all the things that the Sanders campaign has weathered is actually, I think, really impressive in terms of not only the kind of rhetorical attacks, but also, you know, having, I'd say, Warren come in and sort of bring a pseudo-progressive version of essentially the Sanders campaign. She was kind of copying a lot of the Sanders ideas, but then either twisting them or just backing off them when it was no longer convenient for her. So like Sanders, I think, has weathered so much, and I think people genuinely see, I think, really the sincerity within that. They see essentially what the corporate media is not saying because they feel it, because it's something that's not felt. It's something that's not seen. It's a class consciousness that's felt. And I think another part of that, like hearing about that person's struggle, the caller's struggle, you know, I think of all this. I think of how much people I know are struggling. I think of how much I'm struggling, just trying to sort of make ends meet day after day after day, knowing that so many other people have it so much worse than I do. And this is the richest country that's ever existed. This is the richest empire on the face of the planet in history. And yet we have this like crumbling infrastructure, this crumbling healthcare infrastructure, or this otherwise healthcare infrastructure that isn't accessible to people. And the corporate media just is unable to process kind of why. At the same time, there's never this question of how are you going to pay for it, obviously, when it comes to the military budget for which there's bipartisan support. If we had $1 trillion a year, if we were to take that military budget that more or less at this point is almost $1 trillion a year, if you include not only the main Pentagon spending, but all of the other kind of secondary spending as well, these problems would be so easily solvable if you were to really have the kind of political willpower to do that. These problems are not these insurmountable mysteries as kind of the corporate media is always putting them out to be. They're really simple problems with simple solutions, and the solution is often to simply take this money that's being spent on warfare abroad and reinvest it in making sure that everybody has access to housing, healthcare, et cetera. And Sanders, you know, for whatever faults the Sanders campaign might have, he's talking about that in ways that none of these other candidates are doing. I think he's revealing those kind of contradictions.
And Brianna, it goes beyond that. I mean, even from the standpoint of just basic material needs, this notion of people having, you know, 60% of the country don't have $500 in the bank. That's astonishing. One fourth of the kids in poverty Like, these numbers are not numbers necessarily to be proud of.
Did you see the number that was basically saying if you have $500 in your bank account and you spend $2.75 on a metro ride or a train ride on crumbling infrastructure that's hardly working. So if you have $500 and you spend $2.75, that's a greater percentage of your wealth than Mike Bloomberg has spent of his wealth on campaign ads, $400 million.
Think about
compared to that. You spend more on crumbling infrastructure as a percentage of your money than this guy has spent on political ads trying to get himself elected president, $400 million.
And it doesn't have to be that way. That's choice. I mean, it's either implicit or explicit. For the most part, either the system is going to be used with you abdicating your will from it, or you're going to actually marshal your energies into doing something about it, which is, I think, is what Sanders is doing. Chris Matthews, who knows, he gets it, that Sanders taking this is going to fundamentally change the party into a party that cares and focuses on this notion of cooperation in order to get things done, and changing this kind of hegemonic norm of individualistic, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps to something where we're all associated with each other's interests. Let's listen to the clip of Chris Matthews arguing that maybe the Democratic Party should just lose to Trump this time around.
I'm wondering whether the Democratic moderates want Bernie Sanders to be president. I mean, that's maybe too exciting a question to raise. They don't like Trump at all. Do they want Bernie Sanders to take over the Democratic Party in perpetuity? Well, I mean, he takes it over. He sets the direction for the future of the party. Maybe they'd rather wait 4 years and put in a Democrat that they like.
Chris Matthew knows. He knows. Chris Matthew knows exactly what I know, that if Sanders gets in that position and he dominates that office and he puts through the changes that he is talking about, meaning it's not pie in the sky. All of these Democrats that have been screaming, oh, this is pie in the sky, Sanders wants a pony, when really what he's talking about, as you said, is not radical. Let's make sure that people have health care. If a person is born in our society from cradle to the grave, we are the richest country on the earth. We are evolved, and from the standpoint of a society, yes, we're going to ensure that that person is taken care of from the standpoint of health care. And yes, that person can maximize their potential by going to school without tens of thousands of dollars on their back. And yes, we are a better society because of it. Now, Chris Matthews is arguing maybe the Democratic Party should forego all of those issues, health care, everything else, because Trump will go after Social Security. Trump will go after Medicare. Forego that. Allow him to do that, because that is better alternative than Sanders fundamentally restructuring the Democratic Party. That is astonishing, right?
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, it's what we knew for so long. That, I mean, it was, after all, the Democratic Party, it was the Clinton campaign that strategically elevated Donald Trump in 2016. That they wanted Donald Trump to be the candidate because they considered him such a clown or whatnot. But even 4 years later, they're seeing very much that they can work more with Donald Trump than they could with, I think, Bernie Sanders.
Now, explain why,
at least
though.
they have more common ground.
Explain why, because the why is the most interesting part. Why do you think they feel they can work better with a Trump as opposed to Sanders?
Well, I mean, I think there's first the cultural milieu part, that essentially Trump is sort of a product of the same kind of culture that like elite culture that gives us, for instance, Bloomberg. You can find pictures very easily of them like playing golf together and smiling and whatnot. You can find pictures of Donald Trump and Clinton and whatnot. But then there's also that kind of shared class interest that they essentially, like, they are all very much for many of the same policies that benefit the rich and hurt the poor. They share that kind of bipartisan push toward war. You didn't see any resistance really from Pelosi on so many of these things. It was Pelosi that pushed through his
military budget,
Pentagon budget, the military budget. It was Pelosi with getting basically nothing in return. It was even Pelosi who personally invited him to give the State of the Union. So really, like, there's this bipartisan consensus on so many of kind of the key issues that drive what we could call the U.S. empire. Like really the Democrats and the Republicans are on the same page on most of those things. It's kind of these minor cultural differences. Whereas with Sanders, there actually is sort of there is an ideological difference that says that this this money, that this wealth needs to be put to a better use. And I think that's really why they absolutely consider Trump to be a more acceptable person to work with than Sanders.
Well, let's take a quick break here before we come back with our weekly Monday segment, Miss the Press, where we're going to talk a little bit about Russiagate 2.0, 4.0, 9. I don't know. It just feels like it never stopped, and there's like one thing after another. Maybe it's going to go away before it comes back, but I got to imagine it's going to stay in the news a little bit longer. The Sunday news shows doing their best to try to keep it in the news past this weekend and this week. We'll talk about that and more. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Monday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for our regular segment, Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers, where we take a look at the state of education across the country. What's happening in our schools, colleges, and universities, and what impact does it have on the world around us? Our resident expert is Bill Ayers, the legendary activist, educator, and author. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Monday and every Monday for Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers.
Welcome back to Political Misfits. You know, this music, this is our weekly Miss the Press segment where we take a look at all embarrassing things on Sunday talk shows where the press failed to actually talk and stand up to political pundits and where they highlight often, like they did this weekend, the intelligence community. That's where we're going. Those who lie, cheat, and steal are those who we turn to on our Sunday talk shows in America. This weekend and over the end of last week was the talk tomorrow about Russiagate 2.0. This time it's Sanders. We're joined by Brianna Griffith, the producer and host of the radio program People's Republic Austin, to talk to us a little bit more. Those of you who remember on Friday evening, a day after the New York Times reported that U.S. intelligence officials had warned members of Congress that Russia was trying to sway the 2020 election towards Trump, we got a story from the Washington Post that Bernie Sanders had been briefed about Russian efforts to boost his campaign. As usual, there were no details offered, no statements, and just anonymous sources yet again from the Washington Post. Journalists on the left have been warning for a while now that this Russiagate arsenal would be turned against Sanders. Sanders himself said at the briefing only that his campaign wasn't interested in foreign assistance and that he didn't care who Putin preferred in the presidential contest. You know, Jamal, he did go on his honeymoon to the Soviet Union.
Yes, he did.
So all things. So anyways, a lot of corporate Democrats wasted no time diving right in. Hillary Rosen, a Democratic commentator on CNN, went ahead and called Sanders himself a Russian bot.
That's amazing.
So basically saying this isn't Sanders tweeting out, it's a bot. You had John Cooper, chair of the Democratic Coalition, which says it runs the resistance, tweeted a scary comparison of Sanders to Trump, suggesting they're both Russia friendly. John Cooper says Bernie Sanders wants a new NATO and he wants Russia to be a part of it. Who does that remind you of?
Oh, that's
of
sad.
No one.
Yeah,
thank
I
you
have
for
no
that.
idea
Yeah,
what he's
okay,
talking
very
about.
good. Thank
Yeah.
you. Democrat and MSNBC contributor Joyce Allen jumped in with a comment on how Russia, of course, loves Sanders' divisiveness. Joyce said this is a smart take on why Russia would push Bernie Sanders' candidacy. Always remember their goal is disruption of our systems, including our political party. Russia hopes for internal division that keeps us from compromise and working together effectively. You know, kind of like tearing down the person who just won a broad and diverse coalition of voters in Nevada, trying to tear him down. Nothing divisive to go on there. And Daily Beast columnist and CNN commentator Matt Lewis had this gem, quote, "What does it say about American voters that we want what Russia wants? Trump, a right-wing nationalist, and Sanders, a democratic socialist. That's what we're choosing." These political commentators are something else, and so obviously we would then turn to the Sunday talk shows. Maybe they can help straighten things out, but we turn here to Face the Nation. They wanted to go to the intelligence community directly, and they wanted to talk about what the FBI thought about why the Russians wanted Sanders. And Robert O'Brien, the national security advisor, said he'll spend money on social programs and probably take it away from the military. Let me play this clip of Robert O'Brien on Face the Nation.
No. What I've heard from the FBI, what I've heard is that Russia would like Bernie Sanders to win the Democrat nomination. They'd probably like him to be president, understandably, because he wants to spend money on social programs and probably would have to take it out of the military. So that would make sense. And look, the Russians have always tried to interfere with elections because they want to divide Americans. They want to undermine our democracy. But the idea that they want to influence the election and somehow cause the president to win. I just don't see.
So remember now, Rachel Maddow a few years ago had warned that the Russians had hacked into the U.S. electoral grid. Story from the Washington Post, who actually had to retract, was going to shut off the power and let old Midwesterners freeze to death. So the Russians were trying to let the Midwesterners freeze to death, and now they're promoting social welfare programs because it's going to take away from military spending, which is at like 10-1 for social programs, and it's more than the next 12 nations combined.
This is like
that if we somehow start giving homeless people houses, that the Russians win.
The 20 D chess. If we pass, we're going to give people Medicare, education, and the Russians are going to invade once we give them those things. That's amazing
Brianna,
that they're saying this.
What's so nuts to me is let's turn to the National Security Advisor to get this straightened out. That's our Sunday talk show guest, Robert O'Brien.
Yeah, I mean, could you imagine this kind of level of incestuous coverage, which in any of the countries we're told are like these authoritarian nightmares? Could you imagine if, for instance, like in Russia, all of the major TV was just turning to the National Security Advisor, who was just saying who was saying the U.S. doesn't want this person to be president, et cetera, et cetera. Like if you were to flip that script, if any other country had this kind of poor level of media coverage where they were just relying on basically like these State Department and these like different Defense Department ghouls in to just say take our word for it. Take our word for it. These foreigners don't want this person to be president. I mean, it'll be very obvious what they were doing there, and yet somehow that goes completely unchallenged on so much of this.
I heard from the FBI.
That's
like the FBI, like I just called like who at the FBI? Just the FBI.
It's shameless. These guys are stenographers. FBI. Look, there's no analysis in it, right? I mean, it's ultimately the FBI told me this, and so now I'm just telling you what the FBI told me. There's no filter there. There's no newsman in the middle that's supposed to somehow validate or at the very least say, wait a minute, this makes sense. Is Vladimir Putin really out there trying to pick Bernie Sanders and Trump? He's trying to get both. And they it's amazing. All day on Saturday, CNN had the little bar at the bottom. Vladimir Putin is trying to help Bernie Sanders win the race just before Nevada. This is astonishing, right? I mean, are these guys, what's with the integrity of these networks?
I mean, a lot of the major kind of papers of record, for instance, will basically just straight up say, they've been very forthcoming about them working with basically with the U.S. government to kind of with the CIA and whatnot to basically say, this is what's fit to print, this is what's not fit to print. It's not even a conspiracy theory. It's just like it's the legacy of kind of so many decades, starting with Operation Mockingbird, probably going before then, of just basically like State Department, Defense Department collaboration with journalists or whatnot. I want to very briefly point out, like the Washington Post article that quote unquote broke this story about Sanders, like I went down the sources, and the sources were, this is what's quoted in there: people familiar with the matter, some analysts, some social media analysts. They listed an indictment from 2 years ago related to the 2016 election that had nothing to do with 2020 and led nowhere. Prosecutors, just unnamed prosecutors, and U.S. officials. And there was only one actual, I think there was basically one person quoted for it, and that was Graham Brookie, who's a director of the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council, which is funded or supported by NATO, Ukraine, and like Gulf state monarchies like Saudi Arabia. And he explicitly in the article that the Washington Post published that quote unquote broke this story, basically refuted all the evidence behind that. He basically said, no, that this doesn't seem to be what's going on at all. So it's like, I don't know, it frustrates me because I want to teach media literacy classes because this article that was this major quote unquote breaking story that Russia was trying to promote Sanders actually relies entirely on anonymous sources. And the one person they quote, who should be a person who would be entirely in favor of anti-Russia hysteria, says exactly the opposite.
Yeah, and just for our listener, Operation Mockingbird, an alleged large-scale program by the CIA that began in the early 1950s and attempted to manipulate news media for propaganda purposes. I wonder if that program has stopped, Jamar.
Well, there's different programs allowing various. Glenn Greenwald pointed this out. There was a guy who actually won a reward for this. I can find the article, but how all of these intelligence services people being in the media for the most part is shaping the public's opinion to something that's more militaristic. Perfect example of this. Intelligence sources told me that Bernie Sanders is being helped by Vladimir Putin. The next person, Bernie Sanders is a Putin puppet. The next person, Bernie Sanders is a criminal agent.
What I also
amazing.
heard from the media is that Donald Trump is actually pushing for Bernie Sanders. So let's get to more media literacy on Miss the Press right now. Everybody's favorite here, Chuck Todd on Meet the Press. Yes, really pushing the idea that Trump wants to run against Sanders and that there's some sinister plot behind this. Chuck Todd speaks with Mike Pence's chief of staff, Mark Short, who he totally ignores Short's reasonable critique of the procedural screw-ups that the Democratic primary has gone through thus far, and instead hammers this idea that somehow Trump wants Bernie Sanders. Trump wants Sanders. Trump wants Sanders. It's all part of the Russiagate stuff. Let's play this clip now.
Last question. The president had this post-Nevada tweet. Looks like Crazy Bernie is doing well in the great state of Nevada. Congratulations, Bernie, and don't let them take it away from you. The president is rooting on Bernie Sanders for the Democratic nomination?
I don't know that he's rooting on Bernie Sanders. I think he's pointing out the irony that a lot of Democrats today still complain about the Electoral College, yet they have a process that doesn't award the nomination to those who gets the most votes.
Yes!
And so I think he's again...
Does the president prefer to run against Bernie Sanders?
I think the president's comfortable with any of the candidates in this field. He's got a tremendous record on the economy. He's got a tremendous record on national security. We've created over 7 million new jobs, unemployment all-time lows.
It's notable he never attacks Bernie. He attacks Bloomberg, he attacks Biden, he never attacks Bernie.
Trust me, Chuck, this president's pretty
He's not fair. He's just not fair. It's not fair that he's not attacking Sanders. Why is he not attacking Sanders? Why everybody else gets attacked but not... What are you saying, Chuck Todd? You hear yourself, right?
He's insane. The president... And the guy says, look, the president just wants to make sure that they don't steal it from Sanders again in 2020.
He's trolling. Because he's trolling. He doesn't care about the Democrats. Right. He's trolling them.
Absolutely trolling.
And the fact that, Brianna, you made earlier is that Hillary Clinton and the DNC emails showed they had a clear preference for Donald Trump. They were pushing Donald Trump.
Not to mention,
I promise you,
complain about the Electoral College constantly.
And Donald Trump is not wanting Bernie Sanders to run against him. Bernie Sanders, in all of the polls that just came out today, has the largest leads in all of the states against Donald Trump versus everyone else. He has a broad and diverse... Donald Trump said himself he'd rather run against mini Mike Bloomberg because Bloomberg doesn't have actual supporters. He's just buying people. So this notion on so many different levels... It's wild, but this is why we focus on Chuck Todd every week, because every week he does this dumb thing where he says these things. I don't even know what to say this week, but this is where he goes because Boeing and Raytheon and all those that pay for Meet the Press somehow want to hear this guy every week.
Yeah, and Donald Trump himself even basically had said that he would have found it much more difficult to run against Bernie Sanders in 2016.
That's right.
He's straight. Yeah, he straight up said it.
And by the way, I have the video of Bloomberg saying that. Bloomberg is sitting saying, yeah, there's a guy, Bernie Sanders, that polls show would have beaten Donald Trump. So yeah, I think they do understand it, regardless of the way they keep saying this stuff. Hey, do you think Bloomberg is ever going to get any kind of traction after that last debate? I haven't necessarily seen the polling. Well, I have seen the polling on it, but the polling was taking place before that particular debate.
That poll was the takeaway from that debate was that debate didn't help Elizabeth Warren past raising her some money.
Yeah,
and it seemingly helped Sanders more than anybody, and really hurt Bloomberg based on these last polls here. I guess I'm just curious if that's a takeaway. I think what we saw.
Yeah.
What is this debate tomorrow night? Yeah.
I'd be genuinely surprised if Bloomberg actually quote unquote surges, but then again, the standards for what a surge is, the standards for what traction counts as, we've seen the kind of a trope of surging to third place and surging to fourth place and whatnot, and that's kind of what it is. I feel like Bloomberg essentially is in the race along with possibly some of these other Democrat candidates, essentially to try and siphon votes away from Bernie Sanders so that it doesn't break 50%, and so that then it can essentially be decided by the superdelegates. It seems like that's what Bloomberg's real thing is, rather than to actually win anything.
It's not like Bloomberg and Sanders are going to get 50% in each of these next races. Bloomberg needs Buttigieg. He needs these other candidates to stay in. And if these other candidates have the same showing in South Carolina, where are they raising money, let alone that they're just going to limp into Super Tuesday? Because, again, if Sanders is able to win 30, 40%, sure, he might not have a super majority, but if it's anywhere near a majority, the thing if it's a plurality, say he has 30%, the next person has 29%, and the next person has 24%, and they're all bundled together, then sure, ranked choice voting, who does everybody want as their number two? That's the thing. But if it's 40% Sanders, and then everybody else has 15%, 8%. And then they try to take it from him. So I don't even know how the math works out at this point, because I don't know which of any of these other candidates. Joe Biden is not going to be in the race much longer. I mean, all of these candidates are running out of money. So if Bloomberg is the guy that's going to somehow chisel away or hold Sanders back from a majority, I guess the numbers aren't working out for him.
And just to be clear, in the latest poll in Wisconsin, Sanders 30%, Bloomberg 13%, Biden 13%. In Michigan, Sanders 25%, Biden 16%, Bloomberg 13%. In Pennsylvania, Sanders 25%, Biden 20%. And look, these polls have not necessarily been kind to Joe Biden, meaning whatever Joe Biden came in with, he should be very skeptical of these particular polls. And we also have South Carolina. South Carolina has Sanders. Well, let me say it this way. Which candidate impressed you the most in recent debates? This goes to Bob's point. Sanders, 43%, Warren, 41%, meaning debates did help in regards to going into that particular race. So what do you think is going to happen in South Carolina? Sanders has a head full of steam going into South Carolina with a massive win. Joe Biden was barely holding on to South Carolina, especially in context of the black vote. Do you think Sanders is going to be able to pull it out? And if he does pull it out, what happens to Biden?
I mean, yeah, I think it's definitely a possibility. I tend not to be too much of a number cruncher as far as that sort of thing goes. I don't like to make too many predictions, but I mean, I think it's clear that, Biden, is very close to being done. That basically he was running entirely on this sort of like, the Obama nostalgia. He brought it up so many times in the last debate, but I mean, he's not. Whatever one might think of Barack Obama, he's not Barack Obama, and he's not, I think he's very close to being done.
Yeah, we have one call. I just want to slide in here before we take our last break for the show today. Sebastian, thank you so much for your patience and waiting. You had some comments on the Democratic primaries.
Yes, but also in addition, a comment on the recent intelligence, Russian interference.
Sure.
Claim that even though sorry, I'm all discombobulated, but there was an article as of yesterday at 5:52 p.m. from Jake Tapper's, Zachary Cohen, and Jeremy Diamond claiming that they overstated.
Yeah, so we had that article, and Jake Tapper gave a long thread effectively making the point that, this commentary was overstated, that basically it was bunk. That, that they didn't have the intelligence services goes as far as to say there wasn't necessarily a preference in the Democratic primary. Yeah, you're right.
Right, but the other thing, I guess the most important thing that I wanted to at least bring back up, and this is like one of my biggest gripes, I guess, is that we don't have a guarantee that even if Bernie Sanders does get over 50% and has a comfortable margin going up to the convention, we're still kind of looking in this hypothetical that he makes it to there. And this is assuming that if he breaks 40% or so of the delegates, we don't see everyone pull out and effectively coalescing around Hillary Clinton, similar kind of Democratic mega person brought in.
There's no way.
Also assuming that we don't get to the point where Tom Perez says, oh, he's over 50%. Nope. And yoinks it away because he still has the power to do that. And we haven't really addressed that.
Fair enough. Okay.
Sebastian, thank you so much for the call. It's greatly appreciated.
Now, keep in mind, when we're going in the context of the race, we don't have godlike abilities. I mean, Sanders is just a man, just like any other man. And we, for the most part, are pushing for that particular movement and those particular policy proposals. It is very possible that the Democratic Party could cheat him again. He's just a man. He's fallible. He can fail like anyone else. But our goal, just like if we're playing any other game of chess, is to maximize our potential, maximize our decision space. If they're going to take it from them, make them take it from us. If they're going to cheat them, make them cheat them. Make them show it, is my point. The only thing all of us can do, as Bob said, organize, and push, scream, gyrate for very particular policies that we want to see espoused in the world that benefit our material interests, especially that in the interest of class. Now, if Perez wants to take it, if they want to cheat him, if they want to find some loophole in order to rip it from him, fair enough. They can do those things. The only thing we can care about and push for is our particular interests. Make them steal it, is my point. Make them rig the hell out of it. is my point.
Surely make for good radio. So that is going to do it for a quick break here before we come back with more radio talking about some pipeline news here. Hopefully our environment is not completely destroyed by the next election. Jamal, you've been listening to our weekly segment here, Miss the Press, and as always,
you, Chuck Todd.
We're back.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamarl Thomas. We wanted to fit in a few more stories, making sure we didn't miss anything today. Today, the U.S. Supreme Court will consider whether or not to allow for an $8 billion pipeline project to continue. At the heart of the lawsuit is to stop the project that the pipeline needs to cross under the Appalachian Trail, one of America's most famous and picturesque hiking trails. This one destroys me, Jamarl. I think the best thing that this country has to offer is its national parks.
Yes.
And what we've done across the country, to watch the Trump administration slowly carve up and allow for more permitting, to allow for fracking and drilling, is quite disgusting. And now they're trying to allow the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which begins in West Virginia and is planned to cross some of the most mountainous scenery in central Virginia before completing its 600-mile path towards North Carolina. Work in Virginia has been halted for more than a year as the builders contend with a host of setbacks handed down by the federal courts. In order for Atlantic Coast Pipelines to move forward with their project, they will need the U.S. Forest Service to grant the pipeline right-of-way under the Appalachian Trail in the George Washington National Forest. According to the Washington Post, judges from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit threw out a Forest Service permit in December 2018, saying federal law prohibits any agency from allowing a pipeline on lands in the national park system. That includes the trail, the judges said. The pipeline's builders, led by Dominion Energy, appealed to the High Court, the Supreme Court of the United States, saying that the ruling could create an impenetrable wall along the trail's course from Georgia to Maine. Simply put, there is no basis in the federal statute to conclude that Congress intended to convert the Appalachian Trail into a 2,200-mile barrier separating critical natural resources from the eastern seaboard, according to the lawyer Paul Clement on behalf of the pipeline. The plaintiff also notes that the pipelines already crossed the trail at 34 locations. Environmentalists opposing the construction argue that no pipeline has been granted a right-of-way across the trail on federal land since it became part of the park system. Other crossings are on private or state lands or on easements that predate federal ownership, Jamarl. And the big issue, and people are saying, oh, just build it underneath, it's totally fine. Well, above the pipeline on the ground, you actually have to clear out 50 feet. And so basically on land, you'll see basically cleared brush and cleared trees basically above where the pipeline is underground. So you're still having to cut out quite a bit of the scenic routes, and you have to put in several large stations along the way. And so it's going to cut in. And if you're trying to find nature and find a little serenity on Earth and walk down these paths, you're basically going to walk on beautiful nature and then walk into oil refineries and pipelines throughout.
Not to mention leaks.
And leaks throughout. And what you say there is ominous. Pipelines, and this is in the story as well, pipelines are not only dangerous for the environment, Jamarl. From January 2010 to November 2018, fossil fuel pipelines in the United States have resulted in more than 5,500 accidents, 800 fires, 300 explosions, 600 injuries, and 125 fatalities. This is according to a 2019 analysis by nonprofit group Frack Tracker. That's an explosion every 11 days and a fatality every 26 days. So that's in process right now. Also in process, and this comes after a big loss last week, environmentalists took in North Dakota, as people remember, the Standing Rock protests were trying to stop the completion and building of Energy Transfer Partners Dakota Access Pipeline. Last week, a 3-member North Dakota Public Service Commission unanimously approved for the builder to double the number of barrels of crude oil pumped through the pipeline every day, allowing for 1.1 million barrels of crude oil today. So not only did the pipeline, now they're upping the number that goes in there. And if that's not enough of a loss to take here, if those are following the efforts of the pipeline building in Ontario, Ontario Provincial Police moved in against protesters who were stopping a freight train over the last 2 weeks in their effort to stop the pipeline from being built in northern British Columbia. Police have moved in on those protesters and are slowly trying to move them out of the campsites. Tomorrow, the planet is under attack. I mean, it just shows corporations have no care whatsoever about people, workers, or the environment.
I find this utterly bizarre to me. The planet is a real thing. And as human beings, we have a habitable space that we can inhabit, things going beyond the space to which we can inhabit, and we will eventually die out. The scientists, the people who build our cars and boats and planes, the people who effectively tell us about our universe are telling us your behavior on this planet is causing an end to the habitable space to which you inhabit. And people argue, yeah, man, but what about my dollars? What about my dollars? I've even heard people make the argument that if we clear out and the Arctic melts, we can get under that oil that's under the Arctic, missing the point that there's going to be 10 degrees increase in temperatures, and we won't necessarily be milling around in the best of cases. I think it's so bizarre to me. I mean, but in some way, I guess it's a rational action. We have a system that ignores the overarching reality of the world, meaning that this is a planet, we breathe air, and we need our habitable space to be a particular way. And instead, it's how much cash can we make? And if it even comes from the standpoint where life itself is at stake, we still fall on how much cash do we make. I mean, this gets into a political situation where, from a political space, that needs to be changed. And right now, corporations have the run of the mill. And they will end our lives on this planet.
A few other stories to note here. The memorial service for Gianna and Kobe Bryant at the Staples Center in Las Vegas is now going on. It is live following his death from dying in a helicopter crash. The family of Kobe Bryant has now sued the helicopter company, saying that it was under negligence, that the pilot crashed the helicopter. And Katherine Johnson, one of the NASA's Langley's Hidden Figures, if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures, died today at the age of 101 years old.
Wow.
Katherine Johnson was born in August of 1918 in West Virginia and was a groundbreaking African-American mathematician who worked as a human computer for NASA Langley through the space race, including calculating the trajectories of Alan Shepard, the first American to travel space, and giving the go-ahead for John Glenn's historic mission into orbit. A remarkable career and story. And one last piece of news here tomorrow for our listeners. Oh, you're going back to Weinstein. Weinstein facing all sorts of trouble here, convicted on 2 charges. I just wanted to mention Muriel Bowser, those of you listening here on 105.5 FM. She is the mayor of Washington, D.C. This is somebody who's endorsed Michael Bloomberg. Her government administration just sent out 5,000 registration cards with the wrong date of when the primary is here in Washington, D.C. It got moved up to the first Tuesday of June, and according to the Board of Elections, they thought it was the third Tuesday. So Muriel Bowser can't even run a proper election system here in her own backyard. And now she's one of the national spokespeople for Michael Bloomberg. She's had to speak up on Bloomberg's language with women because she is a woman. And Muriel Bowser, for all the money it's worth in the world, somehow came up with, I think what Mike has said I think what Mike has said is that he's used crude language. And I'm pretty sure that all of us can imagine Wall Street 30 years ago, male dominated. And I think we would all be very naive if we thought a lot of crude remarks didn't happen.
Oh, so sad. It's not crude remarks. He had a hostile work environment towards women. Call it what it is. Yeah. I mean, he has all of these NDAs. What do they think these NDAs are for? This notion that it's a consensual NDA that the people that he abused or he went after or he made uncomfortable, that those people would otherwise wouldn't want to talk. Yeah. Totally consensual. We just came to an agreement. They don't want to say anything about me,
Well, as you would remember, though, now at Wall Street, it's no longer dominated by white males saying crude. Like, what are you talking? It's still white male. What are you talking about? And the guy that you're working for now, ostensibly, is a Wall Street bro who continues to say these comments, and he's a white dude. What are you talking about? This is the state of the Democratic Party here. And this is why I still can't get my head around Mike Bloomberg doing well, is because the people like Muriel Bowser, who has Washington, D.C. mayor, London Breed, Washington, or San Francisco mayor, it sounds good on paper.
Right.
But when you actually look down at what they're doing, what they're saying, and their own policies in these cities, it's completely embarrassing,
And
Jamar.
before we end it, we have another Democratic surrogate, Clinton surrogate, apex pervert Harvey Weinstein, getting caught and convicted. His trial does not necessarily spell the end of his legal action. He faces a sex crime case in Los Angeles where he's charged with raping one woman and sexually assaulting another in separate incidents in consecutive
We'll
days.
talk more about that. You've been listening to Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. Thank you to Brianna Griffith, Joel Siegel, Ryan, Dimitri, and Michelle in the booth. We'll be back with a whole new show tomorrow. Thanks again for listening. We're back next time.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.